Welcome to the Exobe Ad Astra podcast, episode 1, Speculative Resistance, with writer Malka Older.
Hello, welcome to the Exobe podcast, where we talk about the craft of writing, history, science fiction, fantasy, science, and other nifty topics.
Hello, I'm Jo Walton, science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also an SF novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, and... what am I working on right now? I'm working on our opinions about Renaissance women and which ones fit our expectations and the ones that don't fit our expectations, and so we don't write about them because we don't like them because we think they were wrong.
And today we're going to talk about speculative resistance and science fictional politics with our awesome friend Malka Older.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, it's been a treat, looking forward to it. So we've been excited to have this conversation because Malka shares our interest in the development of political systems and the formation of political systems, which I look at a lot through the academic discipline of history, and Malka through the academic discipline of sociology, though with a strong political science bent. Malka, could you introduce yourself a little bit for readers who aren't familiar with your awesome work on both academic, political, and science fictional directions?
Sure. So my name is Malka Older. I'm the author of Infomocracy, which is the first book of the Sentinel Cycle trilogy that also includes Null States and State Tectonics. It's a series of political thrillers that are very much about science fictional government and processes and what happens next with democracy and information and big data and all of these fun things. I'm also the author of the collection And Other Disasters, which is short stories and poetry. And I also write for Realm, formerly Serial Box, and have a couple of serials up there, some of which also have to do with government. Academically, I have a doctorate in the sociology of organizations, actually, which is why it comes in very closely with political science, because we talk a lot about how people function in groups, from Sciences Po, and where I studied the way that governments improvise in response to disasters, especially local governments, but all the way up to national, and did a lot of other things on disaster studies and risk studies. And I am now a faculty associate at Arizona State University School for the Future of Innovation in Society.
That's a really cool school for
It's a good title, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, so I think it's very interesting looking at both of your series that are set in the future and have fascinating different political systems, to see the way that they are rooted in the present and that you found paths for them to grow out of the present. When the one time that I've really done something that's using a different political and philosophical system, I totally cheated in the Thessaly books and had people deliberately setting it up from Plato in a blank space, so that they weren't actually working as much on an empty page as they thought they were, but nevertheless they kind of were, and it was not growing out of our present. And having it grow out of our present, having futures that grow out of our present and politics that grow out of our present is such an interesting thing that you've both done. And I'd be very interested to hear you talk about how you did that.
Sure. In some ways I cheated too, or let's say instead of cheated, let's say took advantage of the dynamics of a fictional approach to this thing. Because I definitely, I came up with something that I wanted to talk about, and then I made a sort of jump. I tried to figure out how far in the future I had to go so that I wouldn't have to worry too much about how we got there, because it would be enough time that any kind of improbable thing could have happened between now and then. But still close enough so that we could see how it was related to our present, because that relationship with the present was and is very important to me in the book. I mean, I really wanted to be talking about the present through this funhouse mirror of this alternate system that we could have. And in fact, the system that I put together in the books, it's not dependent on any of the futuristic technology that I invent. That some of it, so the technology facilitates it, but it's all quite possible.
I mean, I would compare it to the way, right now we're voting using voting machines, and voting machines are affecting our democracy. But before there were voting machines, people voted using beans, and that worked too. And so the technology facilitates it, but isn't necessary for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm still voting with a piece of paper and a pencil.
Right. Well, which contrasts, for example, with the way my system is absolutely dependent on having flying cars, without which enabling technology the system doesn't work. And it's neat to think about how you can have a radically different political system affected by technology or enabled by technology, and that those aren't quite the same.
Yeah. But I will say also the other thing about mine and the relationship to the present is once I had come up with sort of the outlines of the system, it's a system that gives itself very much to localization, right? And it's plays out differently everywhere. And so one of the
Can
real
you give us a quick summary for those who haven't read it?
Absolutely. So for those who haven't read, in my book, which takes place like I said, 50 to 60 years in the future, it's a world in which the nation state is largely obsolete, although there are a couple of hangers on. But most of the world has transitioned to what I call microdemocracy, which is the system in which the basic unit of jurisdiction is 100,000 people. So it's roughly, give or take. So it's population defined, not territory defined. And those groups, which are called sentinels, can vote for any government they want out of all the governments that exist in the system. So you're not constrained by where you are. Once you're beyond that small group of 100,000, you're not constrained by where you are to choose between certain parties. You have all of the governments in the world to choose from. And so you have this sprinkling of different systems around the world. And some of the governments that exist are very, very local and really only concerned with local issues and don't compete for sentinels in other places.
So to be clear, a sentinel itself is a unit of population, but it is geographically in one location.
It is geographically bounded, yes.
100,000 people who live near each other. So it might be one neighborhood within a city, or it might be a large portion of a rural area.
Exactly. So there is still a geographical element. And one thing they talk about in the books is, can we move past that at some point? Do we go down to each person can vote for a different government? But at the moment, that's what they have. And so one of the things I loved while writing the books, one of the real pleasures for me was thinking about how this system, this potential for difference and diversity and granularity would play out in different parts of the world. And so that involved a lot of thinking of, okay, if we're here now and we have this different process, like you say, if instead of voting machines, we use this other thing, and if instead of the internet, we have this massive global information management bureaucracy, which pushes information in your face when you're being fed lies, what does that look like in different places? And how do we evolve up to this point in different societies as they are now? So that was a lot of fun for me.
And so the one thing, there are several neat cross comparisons with mine, because it was so delightful having this series come out so close to each other, where both of us were thinking about, I'm not going to say fully non-geographic, but substantially less geographic systems.
Yes.
Is a good way to put it, because geography still strongly affects both of them. In mine, it is the every individual chooses which of a number of world-spanning governments to sign up for, and you obey the laws of that government, and you're protected by the policies of that government. And if you break a law, you're punished by your government. And if someone else violates you, your government negotiates with their government, and their government punishes them while you get compensation from yours. And then they negotiate this on a person-to-person level between the different non-geographic globe-spanning governments. But in both your system and mine, there's a lot of how are the slightly different cultures and attitudes of people in different regions of the world going to mean that they adapt to this in different ways? Which parts of the world are going to have a concentration where there is a large chunk that'll tend to have chosen the same system, and so it creates a semi-geographic, though not institutionally geographic, clustering of similar law? How does this affect situations where some cities will have no majority because they will be very mixtures of different groups, whether it's individual by individual or a group of 100,000 in this neighborhood versus a group of 100,000 in the next neighborhood, versus which ones would have a majority because a larger portion of the people in that area would have chosen the same one. And also the questions of the many layers of government, some of which are geographic. For example, the ordinances and government of a city, which, right now we have countries, but the countries have cities and townships, and the cities and townships also have legal infrastructure. And so when you shift to the sort of zoomed out largest scale law, or perhaps we could say second largest scale law if the largest is on the level of the UN or an international court, the main law to which you pay your more distant taxes and are governed layers on top of the policies of your city as to whether you're allowed to have a barbecue outside, and if so, what safety regulations you have to follow, and what types of vehicles you can have in the area. So that both of us thought and looked a lot about, I think, the many different ways that government can be simultaneously geographic and non-geographic.
Yeah, absolutely. And that question about layers as well, I think, which is one of the things that I think is a key question for governance and political science. And as in our time now, as we see, different supranational organizations like the EU, like ASEAN, coming together at the same time that we see more and more groups trying to fragment from the states that they're in and say, no, we want autonomy, we want independence. And so these questions of what does go up to higher levels and what should stay very localized and granular, I think is really, really interesting and important right now as we try to figure out, we're facing so many global issues. So trying to figure out what is a kind of government that could do a global approach for that. At the same time as more and more, we see these groups saying, no, we want our own, we want authority over ourselves, and not just authority, but in the nation state system as it is, being a state gives you all sorts of benefits and legitimacy that you don't have otherwise. And so trying to even that out a bit.
Well, and I think one of the things we're seeing is that the more the supranational organizations do develop, the more it feels like, I could withdraw from the sort of medium distant government. Mm-hmm. Because there is a further out government that can do the distant government negotiating on the world stage on my behalf things, or the negotiating trade with my neighbors things without needing the other one. So, if you're Catalonia within Spain, for example, or similarly,
Scotland.
Scotland, or I was about to say Wales within the British Isles, the question of, do I become part of this union is extremely different if there is or isn't a bigger union. And so if you're looking at this in, 1400, can I manage alone? The question is very different because you'd have to supply your own military defenses while being very small. You would have to negotiate your own trade tariffs while being very small. Once there's the development of both something like the European Union, which negotiates many of those things and provides some of those things on a larger scale. And then even beyond that, the presence of the United Nations, which, while it has many weaknesses, does mean that there is a sort of a further up infrastructure to appeal to that, isn't as powerful as the future one state that we see in Star Trek, but certainly is a lot better than the papacy, which is what Europe would have had in that role in 1500. Then your calculations as a region of a place or as a very small nation of, do I want to be within this larger nation that is near me, or do I want to not, is totally different when there is the larger supergovernmental option, which I think also is strongly affecting the some nations' ideas about self-fragmentation, though of course there are others that are not in paragovernmental organizations or supragovernmental organizations that are as big as those. Though it's interesting to look at the number of treaties and proto-unions that exist, things like the African Union or the movement toward the Central Asian Union, or a number of other, political alliances. There are actually not very many countries in the world right now that aren't part of a large, slightly super-governmental structure, which is something I think a lot of us don't think about because we see the European Union talked about a lot, but the others much less so. I mean, you mentioned ASEAN, which, when I was discussing it with a group of my students this year, none of them had ever heard of.
Try Mercosur next time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think, and a lot of them, of course, are very trade focused, and don't have a whole lot beyond that. But that is a start, and that is this idea of if we align on certain things, we can do better. We can, it'll be beneficial for us. And I think the African Union is moving forward quite a bit actually recently. Yeah. But I think that the as that is expanding and we're seeing more and more of that, I think that comes from, you mentioned how we're exploring some of the same things in our fiction. And I think that there's this sense now that the nation state system, never ideal, is really showing its cracks. That there's some major problems with it.
Showing its cracks at the same time that the development of both a more robust set of policy for supra-governmental organizations and we've had some supra-governmental organizations for decades now, been able to watch them and see what works and what doesn't and what situations they've run into, that the combination of those things is creating a new set of options that say, okay, what if we don't necessarily get rid of the idea of the nation, but we decide to outsource a number of the functions that the nation has been fulfilling to different things, some of them to the EU, for example, or the African Union or the South American Union if it advances, some of them to the United Nations, some of them to the local city government, some of them to another local trade union, and some of them to retain to themselves.
Exactly.
I think that there was a movement within science fiction which was early and sort of carried on through the 50s and 60s, where we would see a fragmented US that was kind of based on people's idea that the US is actually too big to be a country. In the sort of traditional way of being a country, although sort of looking at the US as like that, with states as countries and the US itself as being the super state thing that was providing things. And then in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we got books like Snow Crash and Ken MacLeod's Fall Revolution books, which sort of mirrored the way that the Soviet Union fell apart onto Western countries. So I think that kind of thing has been around for a while.
The anxiety about fragmentation.
Or also a feeling that the state isn't the inevitable and most excellent thing that you could possibly live in.
Yeah.
How many of those do, this is where Jo, being the Volcature reader who has read a bajillion things, how many of those do or don't involve a one world government also developing? Because there's lots of one world government archetype of science fiction, both in the this is the future of Earth and in the this isn't the future of Earth, but every single other planet in existence has a one-world government and has become a monolith.
So mostly one-world governments go with the end of culture and ethnicity. And you just have bland Earth with one Earth culture and one Earth government. It's rare to see something where you've got that one government and fragmentation. An example that does have it, which is actually a really interestingly weird example, is Robert Heinlein's Friday, where every little bit of Earth, including Wales and Prince Edward Island, which I remember particularly because it was the first time I'd ever seen Wales in a future.
Mm-hmm.
Wales, where I lived and grew up, was a fantasy past within the genres that I was reading. And you did not see Wales exist in the future. So I was thrilled to see one word mention of it in Friday. But Friday has a one world government, and all of these little tiny, still geographical, but tiny independent countries are part of that and have cultures within that. And they have very, very different rules and laws.
So I haven't read that book. In the book, is that portrayed as positive and functioning well, or negative, or what are the tensions that it looks at with it?
It's positive and functioning well, and the villain and tension that it has within it is a transnational corporation trying to exploit tensions unsuccessfully. And it's also got a thing that is like the internet, only it works perfectly. It's the sort of imagination of having the Library of Congress online, and not the imagination of what Wikipedia editing wars are.
Right. So you have all of the...
But, this was long before there was any internet at all.
Right.
It's early 80s.
So it's an archive, but there isn't sort of public participation, crowdsource affecting of it, or social media.
Yeah. Yeah, so the information that you get from it is always entirely reliable and without bias, but you have to search it and make your own search terms to get the information in a way that is unusual and that you didn't see in earlier things, where everything would be archived perfectly so that you could recall it all.
Right.
Whereas this had it, but there was no misinformation in it. There weren't arguments about it. Once you got the information, it was solid.
Neat.
Yeah, and another thing, this is many planets with many governments, but there are sort of two big alignments. Is Delaney's Stars in My Pocket Like Grains of Sand? And there are alien planets and civilizations, and there are human planets that have more than one civilization on them. But there are two different systems of government that all of these things are aligned with one or the other. In a kind of Cold War way, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. It's an interesting, diverse choice. Delaney always at the front of everything like that.
Neat. Well, that's made my thoughts go in several directions, and I think I'll self-indulgently go with the one that was more impulsive, because Jo's reference to being amazed to see Wales in science fiction, and Wales has a future and isn't a place that's only in the past, reminded me very much of how in the political world building of future worlds, when we see them in science fiction, there are definitely patterns to which countries or identities what happened to. You generally, if you know about anything, you know what happened to the US, and you know what happened in at least Cold War era fiction to Russia. You often know what happened to Britain if it's written by a British author, but not necessarily if it's written by an American author. And these days you usually know what happened to China, and you sometimes know what happened to Japan, though those are more recent, sort of displacing the what happened to Russia pattern earlier. And then there are many other places in the world where you don't know what happened to them at all. And so you get, indeed, the Jo being amazed, little young Jo being amazed to see Wales having a future. And I'm reminded of, I one of a notable thrilled fan who posted, "Oh my God, not only is there a scene happening in Belgium, but it's even, at the actual street and at the actual hospital that's really here in Brussels, where I am. I can't believe that Belgium exists in the future. And I recently got an enthusiastic message from a person from the French town of La Tremoille, which features in the books, and who went to a school, an elementary school, which is in the Ducal Palace, which is, again, a building which features in the book. And so it was sort of a micro-representation. But it's also just striking to note, I made a point when I was doing mine of, I want this to feel global. I'm going to make a point of having lots and lots of places that are not the kinds of places that we usually know about the future of be visible and be mentioned. And I also made the decision to intentionally, particularly in the first couple of books, be comparatively silent about America. Because Americans have never had the experience, for the most part, that other countries have of wondering what happened to your country when we know what happened to other countries, but we don't get to hear what happened to your country. And I wanted Americans to experience that. And it was neat having readers who are both from the US and used to other forms of SF, who, even beta readers, when they're reading a chapter by chapter, be like, what happened to America? I have to know what happened to America. Is it something terrible? Why am I not hearing about America? Which was the effect I was going for, sort of painting with negative space. Mm-hmm. But I would love to hear from you, Malka, who also thought hard about global presence, both your ways of thinking about which bits of the world you showed and focused on, and also whether you have comparable reader moments or where someone responded to you and was surprised to see a particular thing or surprised to not see a particular thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I get a lot of people also reacting because they see their place in my book, and I had a similar perspective when I started out. I started in Japan partly because I was working there, and I saw the image there that helped me start the book and gave it some context and some mood for me. But and that had that kind of connection to the cyberpunk history and so on. But I really thought a lot and was really wanted to make it a global book. And I thought that was really important for all the reasons that you just mentioned. And then kind of additionally, because I was talking about this global system that was so localized, that it was really important to show it in a lot of different places. I mostly decided where I would set it based on the places that I had been. That didn't always work out. And occasionally for plot reasons, I found myself needing to go someplace that I hadn't been, in which case I would, intensively Google map and look at it and try to figure out. But I tried to keep it, even if it was someplace I hadn't been, at least, close to someplace that I knew reasonably. And so I just kind of scattered it all over the place. And also, and I do talk about the US a little bit, but I have very few scenes set there and very few characters who are from there, which is why I have very few hopes of it ever being made into a movie. But and I'm happy with that bargain. Worth it.
Yes.
But yeah, it was important to me that we show the whole world and that we think about the way something like this would play out across different places.
Yeah, agreed. And also I think it's, discourse about genre literature is very interested these days in representation. And there's lots of conversations about representation in terms of gender and representation in terms of race and a little bit in terms of religion. But it's neat to have a discourse about representation in terms of geography as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And because there's so much, I mean, still, and as you said, like geography does still matter even in our books. And now certainly, geography matters a lot. I mean, we're seeing that play out in such a distinct and often terrible way right now in terms of vaccines and just, and I think it's really important for us to look because it plays out all the time. And it's just the way that this particular disaster is unfolding helps us see it a little more clearly maybe than we do usually. But you know, that vaccine lag is a lag that occurs with all kinds of different technology and medicine and other just benefits and luxuries as well. And so thinking about how if you are in a place and, you know, even if you're not a citizen of that place, you could be pretty stuck there right now. And that matters.
Yeah. Or a way I sometimes phrase it is when we're talking about the development of a technology, especially something that's a solution to an emergency, but even, you know, food, that developing the thing is often the sort of STEM problem. Distributing the thing is the social science problem.
Yeah.
And it, you know, it's a question of logistics, it's a question of politics, it's a question of identities and understanding prejudices, but also understanding old entrenched systems, understanding illegitimacy, how to make there be trust in the thing. And those are so one of the best definitions of what our social science is about that I've ever run across is all of the different problems which lie between I am holding in my hand a vial of the vaccine and a vaccinated world.
Yeah.
So many of those are social science in all different sorts of ways, because sometimes it'll be one of the most interesting recent problems they've been having with the US vaccination rate that I've been reading about is people not believing that it's free.
Yeah.
Being afraid that they're going to be hit by a secret medical bill that shows up afterward, because the US medical system does that a lot. And that, you know, that distrust, how do we communicate with that distrust? What type of voice do we want to have to try to persuade people to trust? Those questions have to be answered differently in every different culture. In terms of what makes a voice authoritative or trustworthy, what makes a voice unauthoritative or untrustworthy. All of the many different details of the logistics, which reminds me that I had wanted to, in your hat as a person who talks about disaster preparedness, this year at least I've been getting, like most of my historian friends who work on anything near the Black Death, a wide variety of iterations of journalists asking various, if X about the Black Death, then X about COVID, ? And it's been very interesting to look at how many of the most actually useful, as opposed to not useful, comparisons that one can make between Black Death and COVID is Black Death gives us very good senses of how important logistics, policy, and geography are for the, you know, the institutional responses developing, but also how the thing moves, where we have good records and where we don't, what responses are. And, you know, it's a different world where we have an efficacious treatment and the Black Death never did have an efficacious treatment. So there isn't the tracking of the distribution of a treatment, but there certainly is the tracking of the distribution of information, the distribution of particular claims about it. How quickly does the idea that it works X way move? Are very similar looking at the logistics bits.
Yeah. And it's, you know, now that we're talking about this, it's actually a really interesting question for me to wonder, with all those cultural implications involved in the distribution part, it's interesting how misinformation is dealing with that, actually, because misinformation theoretically can just kind of flash global, right? And there's parts of it that do, and then there are parts of it that get local twists, right? Like the idea that there's pork in the vaccine. And so that's something that would be really interesting to sort of track and see how much it fragments and how it's dealt with from like the bad guys' perspective, the criminal minds of misinformation, and how they deal with the localization problem.
Right. I guess that applies to intended misinformation or strategic misinformation.
Yes.
In contrast with the accidental, we think it works this way, we're totally wrong, but, you know, we're sincere. And
yes.
which is a different parallel kind of misinformation.
On the historical plague, have you read Fred Vargas's books? So
Give me a title.
Fred Vargas is a historian and archaeologist known for her work on the Black Death. She also has several series of police procedurals or detective stories, which she calls rompols, as roman policier. So like with the emphasis on roman, there are also novels that have other elements besides just the mystery. And the one that is particularly interesting from a plague perspective is Pars vite et reviens tard, which in English is Have Mercy on Us All. Yeah, it was a very loose translation of the English, so I was nowhere near an English title. And it's really good on some of these elements because, of course, she knows it very well. So putting that recommendation out there for plague related stuff. But what were you getting at, particularly in terms of the disaster response elements?
We think of the Black Death as being an area in which effectively disaster response level logistics on the modern level don't exist. And it's interesting to me to think about how many technologies there were for disaster response that just don't get considered in that way.
Yeah.
So, for example, we periodically, a couple times a year, will receive this is the government testing the emergency to send everybody an emergency text system. And sometimes it'll text you about a tornado or something, which is exactly what ringing the church bells was for.
Right.
And while there are bells that happen at normal times of day, there are bells that, you know those normal times of day. And if you hear the bells at other times, there's an emergency. They can't send words, but they sure make the city spring into action, or the town, the area within the church bell radius spring into action in a way that people understand. And then governments do race to put out bulletins. When the Black Death reached Florence, there was a near immediate response on the part of the government. It was a totally inappropriate response from our perspective, because the response was to redouble their strict restrictions on selling meat from male and female animals in the same meat booth, because they thought that the mixing of male and female blood in food that you were consuming would make generation happen inside you, making you more likely to get sick.
Wow.
Which you can see the beginnings of science behind this idea.
You can see something there, definitely.
Yeah.
And
yes, it's wrong, but it's not unscientific.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if they took some sort of evidence-based approach to figuring out whether it was true, then absolutely fair enough. I mean, it did have that idea of things that we cannot see, right? Things that we can't see and don't understand that are happening that affect us.
Right, that are in the body. There's something in the body that's disruption. And even the idea of this is a thing that is growing and breeding and generative, right? They don't have the germ theory of disease, and they certainly don't have an understanding of bacteria, but they do have an understanding of maybe this is related to the same phenomena that produce life.
Yeah, fascinating. That's really cool. And I think you're totally right. Like, there's so much of this that we put these modern trappings on it, and we think that's all there is. But like so much of it does exist and has existed. And I mean, in if I can call it professional disaster response, there's this kind of truism, which is actually true also. But there's this known thing, which is that the first responders are always the people who are there, like their neighbors. I mean, depending on the disaster, it's the people who are in the next city, or it's the people who live next door, or just depending on sort of the scale and the destructiveness. And that, that's the thing that has been going on forever. People take people in, people bring food. Like, that is disaster response. That's exactly what we do. The thing is, now we live on much larger and denser scales. And so it's hard for neighbors to take on all of it because of density of population. So that's where it becomes something. And I mean, there are other advantages to formalizing it, certainly, very much. But that has always existed.
Yeah. Well, and I think an interesting thing to think about is how, in some sense, the fundamental steps that have to happen of a disaster are the same, and we just are implementing them differently. So it's the people immediately there see it. They have to have some means to tell people and then some larger communication tool sends this information farther so that a larger swath of the populace is warned. And then the people whose job it is to be first responders have to exist and do something. And then the state whose job it is to change policy or implement policy have to be able to do things. And so whether your technology for spreading the word is you run or you shout or you blow a horn, and whether your ability to spread the information to the larger populace is through the radio or through ringing the bells or through a text message, these are in many ways slotting into the same ecosystem of the information has to go out, the response has to come in, no matter your tech level.
Yeah. And there's also that question of who is setting policy and doing the responding, because we think of it now as the state, but that's quite recent. And so,
right.
As you mentioned, it would have been the church, it could have been a guild, it could have been, it could be the state on a local level in the sense of, a town or city. But it's the whole idea that there is this larger entity that will care about disasters in small parts of itself is really new. And I think that's part of why we see so many misconceptions and so much confusion about disaster response, because it's this new thing that came around sort of as mission drift, and there hasn't been much introspection or asking or figuring out exactly what it means.
Yeah, or put another way, we always want to compare what the state is doing now to what the state was doing earlier. And if the state wasn't doing it, but we use the state to do it now, we assume no one was doing it.
Right. Yeah, that's
it. And
it.
we often don't go farther to be like, oh, the state wasn't doing it, but the Dominicans were doing it, or the nunnery was doing it, or this guild order was doing it, or this association of a ethnic subgroup was doing it, that aren't the state. You've also made me realize that I have to recommend to you, Malka, a song. Tim Griffin of Griffin Ed does educational songs for schools. A lot of them are, he describes it as schoolhouse rock, returning, and a lot of them teach mathematics and so on. But he has some that are historical, and he has an amazing tearjerker song called Lucy on the Line, which is about a dam breaking. And it's based on a real event, a dam breaking, and the woman at the telephone dispatch who in that period had to call everybody manually, staying to keep calling more and more neighborhoods one by one to warn people to get out. And it's such a neat glimpse of only in this one micro moment in the advance of this technology would it ever be the case that somebody faces if I run, there's no one at the phone dispatch to call people, I need to stay. And yet, that wouldn't have been true before their phones, and it's not true once phones have alternate dispatches. But it's true in that one little period when this event can happen. And I think another neat element of speculating about future science fictional moments is, when do you get to a situation like that where the tech is at just the right state that, if this person doesn't leave the alternate hyperspace dimension where people transit through, but they remain in order to stabilize the such and such, they would have to be sacrificed, but the emergency gets to save more people. But shortly before that or shortly after that, technology would have been different. It's just such a neat recurring question that happens, I think, in many, many disasters, but exactly who it is who might have to stay to make that difference changes disaster by disaster and tech by tech. We think of this a lot, I think, in terms of when we worry about a nuclear power plant.
Sure. It's coming. You give me a very vivid memory of, the case that happened in Japan during the tsunami there, where in Japan, in small towns particularly, it's very common to have, they have loudspeakers all over the town. When I lived in small town Japan, they would play Auld Lang Syne at 5 p.m. so that the farmers who were out in their fields would know that the working day was over. And they would do announcements like this. And so the announcer in the town hall stayed in the town hall and kept announcing for people to evacuate. And the town hall was eventually destroyed by the wave while she was still there. So it's still happening, and it's still it is, it is a very, both universal and culturally specific, right? How these things happen.
And sometimes not just culturally specific, but also even just unique moment specific, which is to say, what if the town next door had already updated that intercom system so you could also call in from your cell phone and do the message, and then the one town that had implemented that system would not have to make that sacrifice, but the one town that had would.
Yeah. And it's also, technology is not linear, and these things don't always work out the way that they're planned to. And one of the big debates in Japan after, and probably continuing now, though I'm not up on the most recent elements, is this question of seawalls, right? So there were a lot of towns where the seawalls were swamped by the waves. In some cases, there were like gates that people closed, and they were killed trying to close them. And there was one or two places where the seawalls were exceptionally high and protected the town. But the question of the seawall is this big contentious thing for people, because they want to see the sea, because they want easy access for fishing, or other reasons, transport. And so, and it's not terribly clear either, because if you have a big wall, it might protect you, but it also blocks your view if something is oncoming. Right. So it's not 100% clear that it's a protective thing. It's not necessarily good in terms of protecting you from a disaster. And I talked to one place. So this was not even a town. This was a peninsula that came off of a town. So it was like a sparsely populated section of a municipal area. And it had little villages along the peninsula, and each village got to decide its own level of seawall. So you would have a stretch of beach that would have none, and then one that would have 10 meters, and then one that would have 7 meters, and then one that would have 12 meters, and then none. And which it comes back to our discussion about levels of government and what needs to be decided higher, farther away, and closer, because this, is not very effective as a way of having a seawall along a single stretch of coast. And then the main stretch by the town, because there was a national route, a road that went along the coast, that was being decided by the national government. And in other places, it was being decided by the prefectural government. And so you end up with this patchwork, because there's this technology that has unclear effects. And side effects that people don't like or have different opinions about. You end up with a patchwork that's possibly not very effective, probably makes nobody happy, certainly is not environmentally great at all, but does mean a lot of work for construction companies.
In the UK, that kind of sea wall thing that you're talking about is known as sea defences, for the exact reason that defence is something that the national government does. And there have been problems exactly like that in the UK with rising sea levels and that kind of issue. And it was redefined as sea defence, which worked. Specifically to take it out of the hands of squabbling local governments, some of whom were doing it and some of whom were not.
Well, and because defense is very
early 90s.
Yeah. Well, and that makes me think of how defense is something that pretty much 100% of people would say this is a thing the state is supposed to do. This is a thing that government, if there is government, is supposed to do. Because there's lots of variation over time and over culture about what is the job of the state. One thing I've been thinking about recently, particularly because of the cultural influence of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, especially the Roman Empire, is that a lot of cultures which take ideas of statecraft from images of Rome. So the US is included in this, many European cultures, but also places that cultural hegemony have exported Rome as an icon too. Most of those places will instantly agree that a thing that the ancient Roman Empire did is a thing government should do. And so maintaining roads, everyone is like, yeah, that of course is a thing government should do. The post office, there's this sort of there isn't an argument over should the government maintain the post office, though there is over should the government maintain telephones. And I've been thinking a lot of this in terms of healthcare, that one of the reasons there's so much pluralness in the way healthcare is approached is that the Roman Empire, of course, didn't fund healthcare. Many different systems and models for approaching healthcare and who is providing orphanages or who is providing hospitals. Is it churches? Is it monasteries? Is it the Duke? Proliferated across the European and Mediterranean ex-Roman worlds for a long time. But it means we had a radically plural and inconsistent model for who is responsible for healthcare. Whereas we had within this monolithic narrative of Rome a very straightforward who is responsible for roads, who is responsible for military defense, who is responsible for other such things. And I think it's made it easier for states to do the things that are modeled on Rome, and more complex to have a discourse about states doing things that are not modeled on Rome.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I'm thinking in terms of the disaster response too. Like, if states haven't done this before, the whole figuring out what it even is that we're going to do, let alone whether we should do it, becomes really complicated. But that insight on Rome is really interesting, because it is this sort of, people just have this idea of what government should do, and of course that idea often changes when they need something as opposed to when it's someone else who needs something. But still, this the state being something that we all just made up and could make it do whatever we want, which comes back, I guess, to speculative political systems. Let's make some things that fix everyone's problems. It's fine.
Right. Well, and I think when people haven't lived through a straightforward or unstraightforward disaster, you haven't had experiences of it. But even when you have, it's interesting how hard it can still be to tell who is actually being the disaster response. So I have two experiences of fires. One where a friend had a fire in her apartment while I wasn't there, but she wasn't there, but she and I walked home to discover her apartment on fire. And one in my own home where there was a fire in the apartment right above ours. And it was fascinating in both of those cases to experience the immediate sequence of, the fire department comes and police squad cars come inevitably with the fire department. And then, a person comes who brings you a blanket and gives you a form and asks you to fill out another form. And then a very similar person comes, but one of those turns out to be government, and the other one is the Red Cross, which is not government, but government outsources lots of functions to them. And then insurance company people show up and they ask questions and they bring you things which are different from the things that the government brought you, which are also different from the things that the Red Cross brought you. And in the days of the disaster, it can be hard to actually differentiate which is which and tell which of these people is coming from the state and which of these people is coming from a non-governmental organization, whether a capitalistic one or a charitable one, because they all respond and do these different semi-separate, semi-overlapping things. And often, the firefighters know perfectly well what's the Red Cross person's job and what's their person's job. But when the insurance person is there, it's less clear which things are whose job, because different insurance companies do it differently, in the midst of which the person experiencing the disaster, who's in a state of semi-shock or full-on shock, has great trouble telling which of these agents is state and which of these agents is not state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's also, we have this contradiction as well, where government and the state tries in a way to promote itself as kind of all powerful, and disasters always show that up, right? Otherwise they wouldn't even be disasters. We wouldn't call them that. And so I remember talking to people, I think it was after Sandy, who were saying, Hurricane Sandy, who were saying, I don't understand. Why don't they just house everybody? Why is this taking so long? Why can't they just deal with it? And it's such a, it's the fact that this is so hard to do is really not talked about that much. And the fact that government is not, not trained for it, it's not set up for it, it isn't talked about that much. And so we get this situation where there are huge expectations for what government should do without them being defined and without any ways of measuring whether they're met or not. And it's a problem.
Well, and I think it's a problem that ties in a lot to fiction as well, because our depictions of disasters and our depictions of who shows up and what is a problem in the disaster affect this. And there's a neat duality to that, because there's the combo of the author wants to depict something that is realistic and communicates what the world build they're doing, or if it's real world, or if their understanding of the real world or suggests is true. But also B, they want whoever are the central characters of their narrative to be able to spring into action and do whatever the plot requires next, which sometimes involves making particular choices about what elements of the disaster are or aren't dealt with in different ways, and making the state seem stronger or weaker in particular directions in order to facilitate a narrative. And here there are many examples, but even the film E.T., in which the government has this instant, scary tubes response to the situation, is an interesting imaginative world build of thinking about the state and projects a very scary and powerful and ready state in different ways from what one might choose in a different narrative, in which what you want to do is have the state fails to respond to the alien emergency, which is why the protagonist, who is the local swim coach, has to rise to the occasion to deal with the emergency. And those plural decisions about how we depict government in emergency, which are often shaped by the needs of story, in turn shape real people's expectations.
Mm-hmm. I had an interesting experience when I read Walter John Williams' The Rift, which is about a major earthquake in the southeastern US. There's a fault line there, and there's a major there's potential for a major earthquake, and this is a sort of science fiction disaster novel where there is a major earthquake there. And it's a very plural novel about a lot of the people who are caught up with it and a lot of the people who are trying to deal with it. And there are some racist bad guys who do some racist things. And then the government response people, FEMA, kind of get there and sort everything out, and the actual police kind of prevent these racist bad guys from doing their racist bad guy stuff. And I read this book like 2 weeks after Katrina, and it felt like it was this sort of innocent utopia that the book was set in.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to the situation where they're, in real life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, indeed, I think the state is often strategically way stronger or way weaker in certain ways in fiction compared to reality. And I'm remembering the hilarious article I read about the people at FEMA when the first X-Files movie was coming out and was going to finally reveal, after years of the X-Files being a major popular show, but also developing real conspiracy nuts who are obsessed with it. And finally the movie was going to reveal who was behind all the conspiracy and aliens and stuff, and that it was going to be FEMA, and that like the week before the film came out, the filmmakers sent some people to like call FEMA to warn them, hey, you're probably going to get some X-Files nuts showing up because we're going to say that FEMA is responsible for the thing. And all the people at FEMA were like, us? We can't do that. We don't have the means to do any of these things. Like, I watched the X-Files. There's no way we could do the things that you're saying that we... What? Just an amazing, charming moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's also part of the idea that the appeal of conspiracies is the lovely thought that somebody knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. It's harder to face there's chaos and lots of systems that overlap with other systems, and it's
and
all really
uncertainty.
complicated.
I mean, it's the same with the science conspiracy. It's like, prefer to have the wrong information than to have scientists honestly saying we're not sure yet, and this is as far as we've gotten.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was also reminded in this thread of conversation that yesterday I was on Wikipedia looking up electromagnetic pulses and weaponization of electromagnetic pulses and what they do and the way they wipe hard drives and so on. And there's a whole section on the page on EMPs, as well as a separate page about all of the incorrect depictions of what EMPs can do that are in films and movies and television, and the efforts of scientists and the US government to try to get people to depict EMPs more correctly, because the effort to try to implement preparation against, we need towns and cities to be ready for what they need to do if there's an EMP, have been going incredibly badly compared to most other forms of disaster preparation. And they think it's because people's popular understanding of what an EMP does are so completely different from real EMPs. Because in movies, EMPs cause earthquakes and cause volcanic eruptions and cause people to melt and explode and like being in a giant microwave, and they do all these things that they don't do. And it was really neat reading about the people at the government in charge of trying to implement preparedness, discovering that confusion about what EMPs do was so huge. But then also to see Wikipedia attempting to track the history of this problem. As in many situations, the real threat of EMPs mainly being the power stations going down over large areas, and then the lack of preparedness for what to do when the power stations go down.
Yeah, that's another issue, is that so people are awfully worried about EMPs and not worried so much about losing electricity, because a lot of people can't really imagine losing electricity for long periods of time, and we forget how much it impacts everything.
And the inverse, that all of the people who were preppers, who were very prepared for managing without electricity and realizing that wasn't the things they needed to manage the COVID lockdown.
Yeah.
Because
well, lots of people who were prepared for a variety of disasters, but the COVID one didn't follow the narrative of disasters, right? Because the narrative of disasters is one of three things happens. Either A, the government agency from ET shows up with 1 billion people in hazmat suits and tubes and sees the area. B, chaos happens and plucky protagonists who might be, cops or emergency responders, or might be the local swim coach, rise to the occasion and solve stuff. Or C, civilization collapses, and within a week we have biker gangs with skull helmets riding around on motorcycles with spikes on them. Those are the three sort of options in a disaster. And so everything is kind of disruptive and also boring, and you have to stay in your house, and you're not sure the grocery store is going to have avocados. And in the meantime, lots of pop-up food kitchens are showing up because there's weird disputes over people paying their rent. And neighborhood organizations doing one thing and others doing others, and people, handicraft people sewing masks and going door to door and seeing if their neighbors need them, was not in anybody's metric of how an apocalypse is supposed to go or how a disaster is supposed to go.
Now, I was asked this question by Canadian radio about how science fiction had predicted pandemics. And I had all these great examples of how science fiction had predicted pandemics. And then they said, and how is this one different? And I said, 90% of everybody isn't dead. Because in every science fiction pandemic, only 10% of people survive. So I could imagine that, but I'd never have been able to imagine the situation where for 6 months it was illegal for me to see my son who lives only a couple of miles away.
Yeah, and the 90% number is an interesting one that people, I think, very rapidly go to. It was interesting on the EMP page itself. There was apparently a study somebody did at one point suggesting that if a large EMP was detonated in the middle of North America, and it shut down all the power stations, and they remained shut down for a full year, then it is estimated 90% of the US population would die. And this study and this fact were quoted 3 different places on the page by 3 different people who had felt it was super important to put this data in without checking the rest of the page well enough to see that it was already there. That there is this imaginative fascination with the 90% of people will die situation.
Yeah. And we have all these cozy catastrophe novels where that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a whole book by a disaster sociologist named Lee Clark called Mission Improbable Fantasy Documents, which is about contingency plans for mainly government and large industry. So, and why they are total fantasy and would never actually happen. And a lot of the sort of civil defense stuff around nuclear war from the 80s, the 70s, the 80s, the 60s is like that. Like they would come up with some number out of nowhere for what would happen when there was a nuclear strike. And then it would get repeated everywhere. And there would just be this idea that this was, and this is alongside all sorts of, ridiculous things like, they're definitely going to hit this town, but everybody will be able to get to the fallout shelters and survive. It's a really fascinating book looking at how people come up with these things.
And then use them to base policy and infrastructure and budget requests on too.
Yeah, and scare people with and not scare people with sometimes. Sometimes they're deliberately meant to be soothing. And then they say what we write is science fiction.
Yeah, well, I think in many ways when you're trying to prepare for a disaster and you're asked, you must submit an itemized budget request.
Mm-hmm.
The expectation that you can submit an itemized budget request is nonsensical in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is one of the things that incentivizes creating this fantasy document. Because you need numbers to put in to have the money. I have no idea how many miles of weather stripping tape we'll need. Answer isn't acceptable.
I wanted to go back to the thing where we were talking about different systems of future government. I think it would be great if you two talked a little bit more about Ada, if you talked a little bit about the hives, and you talked about the groupings, Malka, the alliances that the different sentinels get into, because I wanted to mention the system in CJ Cherry's Cytine. So in the world of CJ Cherry's Cytine, on that planet and in that associated alliance of planets and space stations, people get a vote depending on their profession, and it is democracy, and people are elected, and the elections matter very much, and it is definitely a democracy. But the 9 groupings of citizens each have equal weight, even though there are different numbers of people within the groupings. And the people who are in that grouping might have a different number of votes in their grouping according to how senior they are. And there is one of the 9 groups is called citizens, which is basically everyone else. And they only have the same weight as, say, scientists or administrators, who are much smaller numbers of people, but they have the same weight. So it is a very job-based, career-based democracy, which is very different from what we have, and it's also very different from the ways that both of you have dealt with this stuff in your worlds.
It reminds me a little bit of the thing where... was it Trinity College, where universities would have a member of parliament?
That's right. Oxford and Cambridge, until the Second World War, had a member of parliament, and Trinity College Dublin still has a senator in the Republic of Ireland. Still have a senator who is elected just by graduates of Trinity College Dublin. Yeah, Emmett gets to vote for his own senator. It's like having an extra vote.
Yeah, well, and it's an interestingly different way to divide up representation, because you get things like, in our current situation, when, say, a piece of electronically related, or computer tech related legislation is moving along, there's nowhere in the process that there's a elected official who has expertise in that and sort of speaks for the people who have expertise in that. There are expert witnesses, which may or may not be called, but nothing within the state requires it to happen. So it's a really neat direction to imagine dividing up a democracy instead of geographically employed.
It is neat and different and well thought through and an interesting part of that world build.
Well, and it's a little bit like the Florentine Guild-based republic, where it's grouped, again, sort of by occupation, but then over time, new occupations develop, and you're like, oh, artists. Well, you're looking at anatomy, so that counts as doctor. So that artists will be in the Doctors Guild. And the groupings getting changed over time, because all these systems have to develop over time. So yeah, I can talk briefly in my future, which is in the 25th century instead of in 60 years. So lots of different speeds for how we get there and how long it took. Every individual, when you come of age, you take the adulthood competency exam at the age you feel ready to take it, which might be quite young or might be later in life. And then you choose which of several world-spanning political organizations called hives you wish to be part of, based on whether you feel that its laws respect the kind of laws you want and the kind of values you want to have. And these hives developed out of earlier extant things. So, for example, one of them is the European Union. The European Union has continued to exist in the far future, and anybody who wishes can be a citizen of the European Union. Another one developed out of the Mitsubishi corporate group, and originally was the corporation and developed further. They were shaped and are enabled by these flying cars, which allow you to get from anywhere on Earth to anywhere else on Earth in about 2 hours, which means that the whole world is in commuting distance, and it's a perfectly reasonable thing to live in the Bahamas, work in Tokyo, have a lunch meeting in Paris, your spouse has a lunch meeting in Antarctica. This is all a reasonable commute in self-driving flying cars, which you can also do work and be on the internet while in the car. And the thought I had is that a generation or two after that technology develops, more and more people are going to be living in the place where there happened to be a nice house of the style they liked for sale at the time that they wanted to buy a house. And their kids are then born there, and it starts to be more and more absurd to people that their kids' citizenship is based on where they're born. And this I modeled on conversations that parents from the European Union have already. I was in Florence at the Villa Itati, which is an institute for scholars in Florence, and there were many couples there where, these are academic couples, and the mother is from Spain and the father is Australian, and their kids were born in Italy and then spent several years growing up in London and have potential citizenship in a bunch of different places, and the parents are sitting around discussing strategically which is the most advantageous citizenship to request for our kid, and can we have multiple ones at once? And so I was thinking about, what if there is a buyer's market for citizenship in which countries are competing to get people to want to be part of that country, which means that if the government is going in the direction you don't want, you leave that, and there isn't a high cost to it. Because currently to change citizenship generally requires not only years of expense and paperwork and preparation, as Jo can testify to, but it also usually involves being uprooted, having to change your job, having to have a new home, being ripped away from your friend groups, and dealing in it on top of the other expenses. But what if you can live anywhere, fill out a form, be a different citizen the next day? It creates a different dynamic between people and their governments. But it meant that when I was trying to say, okay, there's going to be these different hives, is what I call them. And I sat down to think, okay, which ones are there going to be? What's my list? I thought about it developmentally. Okay, we're in, the 21st century or the early 22nd. There are flying cars. flying cars create a problem where people want to be able to move quickly, but there's all these security checkpoints that we're used to at airports. So people would want something that's the equivalent of global entry, where you sign up with an organization and they vet you and then you get expedited access to move through. Okay, so more of these sorts of things develop. Probably at least one of them would be corporate. It would be like global entry. But, what others would there be? Well, the Olympics and other sports games. There would probably be an organization that would pop up that is specialized for helping people continent hop so that they can see a football match and then go back, or see a concert and then go back. So there would be one that's focused on performances. There might be one that's organized through the Olympics. There might be one that's based on sort of couch surfing, or kind of like Airbnb, where this is a trust group of people. Couchsurfing was the inspiration for the cousins, like that you can go to a town and there's someone who's in the same group as you, and you know that you can get to the unfamiliar place, but there will be someone friendly and you can meet up for coffee and they'll show you around. And then if these get more and more momentum and more power, and people start looking to them for evacuation in an emergency, right? In an emergency, is it the state that helps you, or is it the fact that you're a member of the organization that has flying cars that can come from anywhere on Earth in 2 hours and pick you up? Then as war came, and in my imagined development, and things got tense, the people who are members of these organizations, which are mostly elites of various sorts, begin to depend on them more and more for functions we traditionally think of as government. What other organizations would then develop for the people who are outgroup, for the people who aren't part of that? And so one of the hives is the Masons, because people have a tendency to believe in conspiracy theory. And if there's a disaster and the government appears to be getting weaker and these other organizations that you're not part of are getting stronger and you don't know what to do, there is a particular character type who'd be like, well, maybe the secret conspiracy is real and they actually have power, and would show up at the Masonic Lodge and say, can you save me the way the Mitsubishi Corporation is saving its employees? And somebody could then saddle that energy and say yes, and develop that. And there's another one that are the utopians, which develop out of the very interconnected camaraderie of the science fiction and fantasy and adjacent text worlds, which have a lot of diasporic online community formation and organizations and volunteers already. So these develop over time. And the original governments are still there, but they transition to having lesser functions. And this, and I know, Malka, you think about this too, relates to how history doesn't tend to get rid of old authoritative institutions. It tends to diminish what they're for and bring in other stuff. Mm. And, the example I like to use to get this across is the ancient Roman Senate. So Rome is a town, it has a Senate. Then the Senate, over time, as the town grows, represents only a small minority. There are tensions with the populace, so we adapt the Senate to be balanced with having tribunes and other stuff. Then we start getting big and having an empire, and now the Senate is governing an empire. And that's getting unwieldy, and we have dictators brought in, and then we transition to having an empire. But we still have the Senate, and only now the Senate is the infrastructure the emperor uses to have political families to call on for ruling stuff. But now the emperors are getting to be bad emperors. And so then the Senate also takes on the secondary function of being the potential political resistance and the source of people who could be rival emperors. Oh, now we have good emperors again. So it returns to being an infrastructural tool. And now we have Christianity, and then it becomes a tool of tensions between and with, and then the dissemination of Christianity. And then the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and other Goths move through, and we don't have an empire anymore, and we have a kingdom. And in the kingdom, the new conqueror doesn't know how to administer Italy, but the Roman Senate is still there. It will administer Italy. And so the Roman Senate becomes the administrative subordinates of the king. And now there's a king and there's a Senate. And then the king isn't there anymore, and the town is alone again. And it's just a Senate governing the city. And so it gets reused over and over. And even when it doesn't go away until the 1200s. And even then, the descendants of the people who were in the Senate still have a political function as being leaders of the resistance against the papacy and other complicated stuff. You reuse it for different things. So in my future, France is still there. It's a subgroup called a strat that you can choose to join if you feel you're culturally French. And it has a vote in the European Union and representations in that group, but it also is a affinity group that has, through which people organize a variety of activities. And its functions are not the functions that France and China and Poland and Bolivia and all of these places have now, but they're functions that they can have in the future. And that also, tying back to our original discussion of the fragmenting of subgroups, it also means that, for example, you can be part of the Spanish strat, and you could be part of the Catalonia strat, and you can choose to be both, or choose to be just one, or choose to be just the other, or neither. And you can have siblings where one of them signs up for both and the other signs up for neither. And all of these things can thrive side by side, because which type of larger structure is responsible for which needs of a person: representation, voice in debate, protection, policing, law, disaster relief, have shifted. That was a very intense summary.
Very, very comprehensive and fascinating. And those are a lot of the same issues that I look at and think about too. And I think one of the big differences in our books is just the time period, because mine are set much closer. So there's a bit more of that. And because I have Mitsubishi too, I think someone was saying that conceivably they could be in the same timeline.
But just when I did the research, it made so much sense. It's such a large, well-organized group, and the name has lots of recognition, but it also works in Japanese, but also Chinese and Korean, because the same characters are used for it. And there were just all these reasons that it made sense. I think we did the same research and came to the same conclusion.
Yeah, and I mean, I think corporations are figuring out the post-state world a bit faster than states. But yeah, I mean, I was thinking a lot about these questions of migration and identity and belonging, and really one of the main incitements for writing my book had to do with just seeing a lot of secession movements everywhere I went, and getting increasingly annoyed that there's no actual way to do this, that we have this idea that states should just always be the same. They change sometimes, but very, very reluctantly. And then the nation state part, which means that the population of the state should remain the same and somehow be identified with the state. And it's just so ridiculous. Like, I find it ridiculous that all these controls on moving around, on immigration. It's silly and counterproductive, and generally in bad faith.
And that whether you're grouped with a bunch of people who favor this style of government versus who favor that style of government is based on who your parents happen to be,
or where they happen to live.
Yes.
And so, I was thinking a lot about these, and especially when we're talking about, when we live in a world that venerates, for the most part, democracy, and has this idea of, oh, you get to choose your government, except not really. And if we can't, if we don't have movement between places and easy changing of citizenship, how much democracy do we really have? And so, quite a bit of my whole schema in the book is built around these ideas. It's less radical than yours because it is closer in time, and I wanted that linkage. But one of the things that's pretty critical to mine is that because the jurisdictional units are based on population rather than territory, there's an incentive for governments to promote immigration into their territory. So, if you are the government if you've won a Sentinel 1 year, and if you can get, enough people to move in there over the next 10 years between elections, or enough people to have a lot of kids, I guess, so that you have 150,000 by the time the next election comes around, all of a sudden you have 2 Sentinels for the price of one, basically. So there's actually, and there are a couple of governments in my world who are bigoted in various ways and do not want immigration. And they are allowed to put their own immigration controls on, but the vast majority want immigration to happen. And so it is that situation of governments competing for people to become their citizens, rather than the other way around, which makes so much more sense. And
it creates a greater opportunity for government accountability. And I think it makes a lot of things that are non-viable otherwise more viable again in different ways. So, for example, one of the hives in my future system is an absolute monarchy. And, it has its flaws just like all of the other ones, but it is not nearly as much more flawed as an absolute dictatorship usually is, because the people who are the subject of the absolute dictator can decide not to be in a minute.
Yeah.
And so he can't be tyrannical because there's an instantaneous right of exit.
Yeah.
And indeed, the countries compete to be desirable and to get citizens to join them. And the only one of the complex and difficult joining process that requires a year of interviews and so on is because it's trying to appeal to the kind of person who likes there to be a complicated and difficult joining process.
Right.
Counterintuitively, some people find that appealing. And I've been in meetings at our university where, sometimes a program will introduce a thing where you can't just do that major. You have to apply to be in that major. And the number of people who try to do it will go up because exclusivity is appealing to some mindsets. Exclusivity and also meritocracy, or the image of meritocracy.
The perception of it. Yeah.
I'm glad I asked that question. Those were great answers.
Yeah, it was a good one.
Yeah, it was. And I think it shows both how much right of exit and immigration policy both need to be thought about. Because notice how there's almost no discourse about right of exit. And we have very little discussion of, that country is being tyrannical, they're making it extra hard to leave. Except when there's a genocide or something going on. Mm-hmm. But other than when there's state violence, we don't discuss it being a merit of one country versus another if their right of exit is easier or harder. I'm also reminded by one of the comments you made, Malka, of a similarity between government systems and ways of making a book or writing, which is to say, people think of technologies very much as sequential, and that you're using clay tablets until you have papyrus, and then you're using papyrus until you have paper, and then you're using paper manuscripts until you have a printing press, and that there's a tree and you just stop using the old thing when you get to the new thing. And similarly, there is this discourse, and you see this in Civ, the video game, which has these trees, that you develop certain things, then you leave behind older forms of government, and eventually you develop democracy. Mm-hmm. But in both of these cases, people use all these systems at the same time. Mm-hmm. People still write manuscripts. People still buy blank books and write in them. People use paper. People also write on actual animal skin because it's fancy. You can get a tweet made into a cuneiform tablet on clay by an online service through Etsy if you want to, because people think it's nifty. And similarly, people layer government systems on top of each other so that, there's still a papacy and it still does the things that it does. And there's still the Dominicans and they do the things that they do. And there are parts of governments that are based on ancient lottery systems and others that are based on older or newer forms of republics and of monarchy and of executive. And just like the rest, when there are emergencies, you often reach for whichever thing still works. And just as when we look at, emergency situations and famines in Siberia, where people will start writing on birch bark again because birch bark is there, when there are political tumults, you reach for whatever forms of organizing of power exist on the micro and macro levels, and you get even sort of more layering, I guess is where I'm going. That one of the things emergencies do is bring out of the woodwork the extra ways of organizing power that we have that might be dormant during many situations, but get called upon during emergencies when there's extra need to organize.
Yeah, absolutely.
Malka, where can listeners find more of your amazing stuff?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at m_older. You can also look up my WordPress site where I have a page with all my publications, including lots of short stuff that's free to read online, as well as, of course, my novels and my collection and my serials and other for-pay short stories. And I have an author page on Facebook that I don't update as much as I should. So mainly look for me mouthing off about stuff on Twitter.
And Infomocracy is the book to start with.
Infomocracy is absolutely the book to start with. And then read the sequels because they expand a lot.
They set together. Great. So, Jo, what's a book that you've been excited about?
Well, I've recently finished reading Caroline Moorehead's A House in the Mountains, which is book 4 of her Resistance Quartet. And these are history books about women in the underground in France and Italy in World War II. And they are meticulously researched nonfiction with a lot of quotes and footnotes and that kind of thing, but very well fluidly written and easy to read. Easy to read apart from the atrocities. And they are very, very good. She's a really great writer, and she's uncovered a lot of the history of the involvement of women that hasn't been foregrounded at all ever. And these are very recent books. This one just came out last year, and they are terrific. She is terrific. I thoroughly recommend all 4 of them.
Awesome. All right. This has been a great conversation, but now, by tradition, we shall end with all 3 of us will gush about a book that we've been excited about lately, which can be any kind of book, anything that we've been excited about. And then finally, the administrative required podcast stuff.
Malka, what have you been excited about?
Well, right now I'm finishing my reread of the first 2 Will Darling books by KJ Charles because I'm very excited to read the third, but I haven't started it yet. So technically, I'm really excited reading Annalee Newitz's 4 Lost Cities, which is just a really interestingly angled and in-depth look at 4 cities that have been formed and abandoned at different points throughout history in different parts of the world, and what that tells us about our own cities today. And it's really a great work.
Which are the cities?
Çatalhöyük, Pompeii, Angkor Wat, and then the 4th one I actually haven't gotten to yet, but you can look it up.
Cool.
Oh, how interesting. What a great selection, even just those first 3. That's awesome.
It's a really cool book.
And Ada, how about you?
So a book I was just rereading because it's had an animated adaptation and that I was reminded of when we were discussing some of the depictions of fragmentation or success or emergencies influenced by Cold War stuff is the standalone graphic novel Superman Red Sun, which is an alternate version of the DC universe in which Superman, instead of landing in the US, lands in Russia. And so as the USSR moves into its powerful state, he becomes the right-hand man of Stalin and the sort of representation of Soviet ambition and success. And Lex Luthor then becomes, because they inevitably have a rivalry, then becomes the sort of champion of capitalism / mad science. And the thing that's really neat in it is that the Soviet Union, as we know, tried lots of experiments, things like trying to farm in Siberia, that just failed. But if you have Superman, and he can instantaneously go to Siberia and solve the problem immediately, you can make all those failed experiments successes, except that over time they get more and more and more and more dependent on always solving them with one thing, always solving it with him. So that you get the gradual development of a world with a greater and greater and stronger Soviet Union that is more and more absolutely dependent on just Superman and only Superman to solve all things, be it a kid falling off a skyscraper or a volcanic eruption or needing to have enough food next year, versus an increasingly shrinking techno-capitalist state led by Lex Luthor, which represents the opposite of we're using lots of different texts and lots of different means to solve things, which in some sense also depends on one person, but it's one person who's giving the means to do this to others. So it's a very interesting study both of Cold War, how it might have gone if technologies and power worked slightly differently, but also what is the difference between depending on one thing that solves everything versus depending on one epicenter source of the technologies with which a plural population can then solve everything. A neat reflection on both history and disaster.
Okay, so this podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives International 4.0 license. Because Creative Commons is awesome.
You can support us and get episodes in advance at patreon.com/Ada Palmer, and support Jo and get her awesome poetry at patreon.com/BlueJo.
And you can find us on Twitter and our books and things at jowaltonbooks.com and adapalmer.com.
And thank you again, Malka, for coming, because this was fabulous.
So, until next time, ex urbe ad astra.
Ad Astra.
Ad Astra.